Higurashi no Nakukoro ni has the distinction of being one of the most popular entries in the world of Japanese animated horror. With the new anime series renewing interest in the franchise as a whole, I found myself returning to older adaptations of Higurashi's story, hoping to find fresh takes on Higurashi's unique brand of horror. Since its original incarnation in a series of very long visual novels, one of Higurashi's greatest strengths has been in its sound design. Higurashi's author, Ryukishi 07, knew how to utilize sound to make the most of the limited resources he was working with when he first began writing the story. This proved extremely effective when paired with the assets of a visual novel, which still allowed for a lot of imagination on the part of the reader despite providing more concrete information than a traditional book. What I discovered upon going through some of Higurashi's adaptations outside of the visual novel is that this focus on using sound to elevate horror has gone woefully underutilized. Somehow, despite having more resources at their disposal, major studios have failed to recreate what Ryukishi managed to cobble together with a box of scraps. Sound is one of the most overlooked parts of any audiovisual medium. People who work with audio will tell you that you know you did good work when nobody comments on it. For the average consumer, what goes into making good audio isn't as readily identifiable as something which may go into an impressive visual, but everyone will notice if your audio is bad. It's not something you can really hide. When it comes to horror especially, sound cues have become some of the genre's most basic tropes. Good sound in horror sets a mood that can keep you on edge, bringing to life horrors just beyond the screen. Ryukishi understood this when he was making the original visual novels. In fact, his novels are generally classified as sound novels rather than visual novels, though the very loose classification system of visual novels is another topic entirely. Point being, Ryukishi knew how to use and emphasize sound. So how did later adaptations manage to screw this up? We're going to look at one scene that takes place early in the story of Higurashi, so you don't have to worry about spoilers if you haven't made it all the way through the series yet. For context, two characters, Reina and Keiichi, are at the garbage dump on the outskirts of town. Reina likes to come here and sift through the trash in search of treasure. Keiichi, a newcomer to this town, has just met a traveling photographer who tells Keiichi about a grisly murder that happened here only a few years prior. The photographer is interrupted before he can give too many details and he leaves, but Keiichi is curious now. While he and Reina leave the garbage dump, he comes to think that Reina might have some information about this murder and asks if she knows anything. He asks a vague question and Reina responds in kind, claiming that she only knows there was some kind of dam being built. Undeterred, Keiichi presses her, asking if there was an accident of some kind, to which Reina responds. Keiichi is shocked by this response, not by the words themselves, but the tone. He notes that it wasn't an answer as much as it was a rejection of the question itself. This scene is seminal. For most readers and for Keiichi himself, this is the first real hint that something is amiss in this rural town, and as such, this scene always shows up in Higurashi's adaptations, and they almost always manage to mess it up. So let's look at how this scene played out in a few other mediums. First, the original Higurashi Anime, which aired back in 2006.
Na, Rena, ここで昔なんかあったのか?
ダムの工事をやってたんだって。詳しくは知らないけど。
ダムの工事? 例えばさ、その工事中になんかあったとか、事故とか。
知らない。
え？
レナ、去年までよそに住んでたの。
レナも転校生だったのか? 俺はてっきり。
だからね、それ以前のことはよく知らないの。ごめんね。
ああ、そうか。
This scene works decently well. If you pay attention to the mix, you'll hear the music fades out before Reina answers the question while the sound of the cicadas grows to dominate. The cicadas have an eerie quality to them, something which Ryukishi would capitalize on whenever he had the opportunity. The sounds of the cicadas persist, subtly growing even louder as the scene continues. It works as a brief but unsettling moment before returning to the wider episode. Now let's see how this compares to the 2020 anime Higurashi Go, which features a functionally identical scene in its first episode.
なあレナ、あそこで昔なんかあったのか？
ダムの工事をやってたんだってね。はう。
その工事現場でさ、何か起きなかったか？例えば事故とか事件。
知らない。
え？
実はね、レナも去年までよそに住んでたの。
え？レナも転校生だったのか？俺はてっきり。
だからね、それ以前のことはよく知らないの。ごめんね。
Better, I think. This time, the cicadas are already buzzing when the scene begins, and there's no music track at all. The cicadas grow loud in the frames leading up to this shot before the sound cuts out completely. This is a trick that Higurashi Go uses a lot during its episodes, these extreme close-ups with stark lighting. It balances a problem that was used to criticize the 2012 horror anime Another, which I've heard criticized as having too pretty an art style, which didn't lend itself to horror. Higurashi Go similarly uses a very pretty art style, and uses these high contrast shots to bring an unsettling feel. It also makes use of the hidden eyes thing that the 2006 anime used whenever a character was being spooky. Contrast, in general, not just in horror, is a good way to delegate importance to specific scenes or shots. That's why when you watch a movie and something is grabbing a character's attention, the movie cuts to a close-up of that thing before cutting back. The same works here. Anime, in general, tends to keep a fairly wide or medium view of its characters, so when there's this kind of unique close-up, it draws attention and focuses the feeling of the scene. In this sense, I think that the 2020 version of the scene is even better than the 2006 version. Now let's look at some comparably worse renditions, both of which coincidentally are live action. First, the 2008 live-action film adaptation, featuring some choice acting and editing decisions. This scene uses no audio contrast like the previous two examples, as the cicadas are the only thing you hear in the background without any kind of variation. Instead, this adaptation attempts to unsettle with the speed of the cut, which works more to disorient than to scare.
ありがとう。
レナ、
え？
あのさ、ここで殺人事件があったって本当か？
知らない。
そっか。
今日楽しかったね。
ああ、おかげでこの村の全体像がかなりつかめたよ。
よかった、圭一君が喜んでくれて。よかったね。
Remember what I said about visual contrast? Notice that there's none of that here. Well, there's one instance of it, but it makes no sense. In the two animated examples, even in the manga example, the focus of the scene is on Reina's rejection, so she's always given the focus. Here, however, the cut into a closer shot happens on Keiichi, not on Reina. For this whole scene, Keiichi is shot in a medium while Reina is shot in close-up. Because of this bizarre cut-in to Keiichi, the focus of the scene shifts to Keiichi's question. I think the implication that's supposed to be here is how she's cutting him off, and that's how she rejects the question. But then Reina immediately changes the subject and Keiichi goes along with it. What are we supposed to glean from this? The audience has no real time to sit in that uncomfortable moment like in previous adaptations. Finally, let's look at the 2016 live-action television series. And if you thought the acting in the film adaptation was questionable, brace yourselves.
なあレナ、昔ここで何かあったのか？
ああ、ダムの工事やってたんだってね。詳しくは知らないけど。
そのダムの工事現場でさ、何か起こんなかったか？例えばさ、事故。
知らない。
え？
実はね、 レナは去年までよそに住んでたの。
レナも転校生だったのか。ああ、俺はてっきり。
だからね、それ以前のことはよく知らないの。ごめんね。
そっか。
Hey, at least they tried. They did at least a little creative work with the sound. The cicadas are a really subtle touch in this one, only showing up briefly after Reina's rejection. Plus they have some spooky vocals going on, so it's at least better than the movie adaptation. And Reina is facing away from Keiichi, which worked really well in the 2006 adaptation. But this scene still relies on Reina cutting off Keiichi's question to generate its tension. Now you may be saying, but Ozzy, isn't she always cutting him off? And yes, kind of. This is what I mean when I say contrast draws focus and indicates importance. The most key element of horror is in the subtext. That's why most horror movies are shrouded in darkness, why people tend to find movie monsters scarier before they know what the monster looks like. That fear of the unknown, of what could be lurking in the shadows, is what makes horror most effective. And not just in this scene, but in Higurashi as a whole, this subtext comes across not in the dialogue itself, but how the audience has to sit, briefly, with a sense that something, just something, is off. Also, I wasn't really sure where to put this, but the TV show was filmed at 30 frames per second, which is weird because for those of you who don't know, most of the movies or TV shows that you've seen that are live action are just shy of 24 frames per second, but this was shot at 30 for whatever reason, so the motion's really smooth looking in kind of a weird way. I don't know, this whole TV show is weird. Like, look at all these long takes.